The first thing people noticed through the whiteout wasn't light exactly, but the absence of stubble. While every structure in Grover's Bend groaned under the weight of ice and killing wind, one building stood perfectly still against the darkness. A small cabin at the edge of town, its walls black as coal, radiating heat into the frozen night like it existed outside the storm's reach entirely. And inside, the woman they'd spent 6 months calling crazy was boiling water for tea. 6 months earlier, Rita Kovach had made a decision that turned her into the town's favorite punchline. She announced at the hardware store that she was tearing down the wooden siding on her dead husband's cabin and replacing it with volcanic stone. Not brick, not concrete block. Volcanic stone, shipped at enormous expense from a quarry 3 states away. Basalt, she'd said to Jim Hendricks behind the counter, her voice flat and certain. Densest natural insulation on Earth. Holds heat in winter, stays cool in summer. Vikings built with it. Romans used it for foundations that lasted 2,000 years. Jim had nodded slowly, the way you nod at someone describing their UFO sighting. That's gonna cost you, Rita. Already paid. Word spread fast. By afternoon, half of Grover's Bend knew that Rita Kovach, 54 years old and 2 years widowed, was spending her entire savings on some crackpot construction project nobody understood. The other half heard by evening. At the diner, Margaret Flynn shook her head over coffee. She's lost it. Carl's death finally broke something loose. Volcanic rock, someone else muttered. What's next? Lava moat. But Rita wasn't listening to any of them. She'd stopped listening the day Carl died of a heart attack in their bedroom, 3 hours before the ambulance could reach them through a spring snowstorm. 3 hours of waiting while her husband went cold on their bedroom floor because the roads were impassable and the phone lines were down, and their house was too far from town for anyone to help. She'd learned something permanent that day about distance and self-reliance, about how fast comfort could turn to catastrophe when systems failed. The trucks arrived in early May, hauling stone so black it seemed to absorb light. Each piece rough-cut and heavy, dense enough that 2 men struggled to carry what would have been a single-person load of regular stone. Rita met them at dawn every morning, directing placement while contractors shook their heads. "You're building a fortress," one of them said, not quite joking. "I'm building something that'll stand," Rita corrected. The cabin sat on 5 acres at the northeast edge of town, exposed to weather that came screaming down from Canada without anything to slow it. Carl had always talked about adding better insulation, maybe vinyl siding, but he died before getting around to it. Now Rita was doing something he never would have imagined. She had the contractors strip the wood siding completely, then frame a second wall 18 inches outside the original. The gap would be filled with dense insulation, and the outer wall would be pure volcanic stone, 2 feet thick at the base, mortared so tight a knife blade couldn't slip between joints. "You planning to survive a nuclear winter?" the foreman asked, wiping sweat from his face. Rita looked at him steadily. "I'm planning to survive the next regular winter." He didn't understand. None of them did. They saw her as a grieving widow spending money irrationally, building something excessive and paranoid. What they didn't see was the woman who'd held her husband's cooling hand for 3 hours while snow buried their driveway, and help couldn't come. The woman who'd burned through 2 cords of firewood that winter, just trying to keep the pipes from freezing. The woman who understood exactly how fragile their position was out here. By July, the wall stood complete. Black volcanic stone rose from foundation to roofline, broken only by small, deep-set windows fitted with triple-pane glass. The roof was reinforced and insulated so heavily it could have supported a truck. Rita had them install a wood stove with a heat battery system, ceramic cores that absorbed warmth during the day and released it slowly through the night. In town, the jokes intensified. "Rita's bunker," they called it at the gas station. "Witch's Tower," someone else said, because the black stone did look medieval in a certain light, ancient and deliberately fortified. Margaret Flynn started a running joke about Rita preparing for the apocalypse. What's she expecting? Meteor strike? Zombie horde? But Rita just kept working. She stocked the cabin methodically. Preserved food, water filtration, medical supplies, batteries, fuel. She tested the wood stove weekly, monitoring how long the ceramic cores held heat. She sealed every gap, checked every joint, made sure the ventilation system worked flawlessly. And when October came and the first cold front pushed down from the Arctic, she was ready. The forecast arrived on a Tuesday. A massive system stalling over the northern plains. Historic snowfall predicted. Temperatures dropping below anything in recorded history for the region. Most people in Grover's Bend did what they always did. Stocked up on groceries, checked their furnaces, assumed the power company would keep things running. Rita looked at the forecast and felt something cold settle in her chest. Because she recognized the pattern. The same kind of system that had killed Carl, only bigger. Much bigger. She made one last trip to town for fuel. At the hardware store, Jim Hendricks noticed her loading propane tanks. "Storm's not supposed to be that bad," he said. Rita met his eyes. "Yes, it is." She drove home, sealed herself inside the black stone cabin, and waited. The storm hit Grover's Bend 3 hours ahead of schedule, and by the time people realized how bad it actually was, preparation had already become survival. It started as wind. Not the usual prairie gusts that rattled windows and bent trees, but something sustained and brutal, a wall of frozen air that slammed into structures like a physical force. Then came the snow, thick and sideways, visibility dropping to nothing within minutes. Temperature plunged from 20 degrees to 0 to 10 below, then kept falling. Inside the Morrison house 4 blocks from Main Street, the power flickered twice before dying completely. The furnace cut off mid-cycle, and within an hour, frost began forming on the inside of the windows. "It'll come back on," David Morrison told his wife, but his voice carried uncertainty he couldn't hide. It didn't come back on. Across town, the same scene repeated in house after house. Heating systems failing, backup generators struggling in the extreme cold, some refusing to start at all. Pipes beginning to freeze within walls as temperatures dropped to 40 below, then 50 below, numbers that turned exposed skin black in minutes and made breathing painful. By the second day, desperation had replaced inconvenience. The Hendricks family burned furniture to stay warm after their woodpile ran out. Margaret Flynn's generator died when the fuel line froze solid, leaving her and her elderly mother huddled under every blanket they owned in a house dropping steadily toward 0. The roads were completely impassable, snow drifted 15 feet high in places, the wind so vicious that even emergency crews couldn't move. Grover's Bend was cut off, isolated, failing one frozen house at a time. And then someone noticed the cabin. It was David Morrison who saw it first, standing at his upstairs window trying to decide whether walking to town for help was suicide or their only option. Through the blowing snow, across the white void where the fields used to be, he saw something that didn't make sense. A small building, dark against the storm, with no snow piling against it. The drifts curved around it somehow, sliding past instead of burying it. And through one small window, a steady amber glow. "That's Rita Kovach's place," he said slowly. His wife came to look. "How does she still have power?" "She doesn't." David stared at that impossible light. "She has something else." The walk to Rita's cabin nearly killed them. David and his wife made it only because they stayed together, moved slowly, and the distance was just short enough. The cold was unlike anything either had experienced, a physical presence that penetrated every layer they wore. Twice David thought they'd lost direction completely, the world nothing but white static in every direction. Then the black stone emerged from the storm. The cabin looked exactly like what people had joked about. A fortress. The volcanic stone walls absorbed the blowing snow, the deep windows revealed nothing from outside, and the entire structure emanated a sense of permanence that made their own house feel like a cardboard box in comparison. David pounded on the heavy door, his fist numb inside frozen gloves. For a long moment, nothing, just wind and white noise and cold pressing in from all sides. Then the door opened inward. The temperature difference was so extreme it felt like stepping between worlds. Warmth rolled out, dry and steady, surrounding them instantly. And Rita stood there, calm and unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting visitors all along. "Get inside," she said. The interior was smaller than they remembered, the thick walls taking up space. But it was warm, genuinely, completely warm. The wood stove radiated steady heat, and the ceramic battery system glowed faintly along one wall, releasing stored warmth in gentle ways. David's wife started crying immediately, the combination of warmth and relief too much to contain. Rita closed the door, the heavy seal cutting off the storm absolutely. "How many houses still have heat?" she asked. "None," David managed. "Not that I know of." Rita moved to the window, looking out at the buried town. Storm's not even halfway through. Over the next 6 hours, others arrived. First the Hendricks, then Margaret Flynn supporting her mother through snow up to their waists. Then 4 more families who had heard through dying cell phone batteries that Rita Kovach's cabin still had heat. Each time Rita opened the door, the same scene repeated. Frozen, desperate people stepping into impossible warmth, barely believing what they were experiencing. The cabin shouldn't have held this many people comfortably, but somehow it did. The volcanic stone walls trapped every degree of heat. The wood stove burned steady and efficient, needing far less fuel than any normal system. The ceramic batteries radiated gentle warmth even hours after the fire banked low. How is this possible? Margaret asked, standing close to the glowing wall panels. Stone's dense, Rita said, adding another log to the stove. Takes heat and slowly releases it the same way. Once these walls got warm, they stay warm. They're basically a battery themselves. You knew, David said. When you built this, you knew something like this would happen. Rita shook her head slightly. I knew something like this could happen. There's a difference. Outside, the storm intensified. The temperature dropped to 60 below zero. The wind reached sustained speeds that bent metal and shattered frozen wood. 3 more houses in town lost their roofs to ice accumulation. Power lines snapped so completely that even after the storm, it would take weeks to restore service. But inside the Blackstone cabin, 17 people stayed warm and alive. Jim Hendricks sat near the stove, watching Rita methodically prepare food on the flat cooking surface. His voice came quiet. I laughed at you. At the hardware store. We all did. Rita didn't look up. I know. You spent everything on this. Your whole savings. Yes. And now it's the only thing standing between us and dying out there. Rita finally met his eyes. It was always going to be the only thing standing. That's why I built it. The weight of that settled over everyone in the small space. Because they all understood now what they'd been too comfortable to see before. Rita hadn't built this cabin out of paranoia or grief or madness. She'd built it out of clear-eyed understanding that the systems they all depended on could fail completely, and when they did, preparation was the only thing that mattered. The storm lasted 5 days. By the end, Grover's Bend looked like something from an Arctic expedition gone wrong. Buildings half buried, roads erased, the entire town transformed into a white wasteland broken only by one small black stone cabin that had never wavered. When the National Guard finally reached them on the 6th day, fighting through drifts taller than their vehicles, they found the town in crisis. Frozen pipes had destroyed plumbing in nearly every building. Dozens of families had suffered mild frostbite. The elementary school's roof had collapsed completely under ice weight. The damage would take months to repair, the cost staggering. But they found no casualties. Because 17 people had sheltered in a cabin built from volcanic stone, and they'd told others through ham radio before communications died. And those people had made it to neighbors with better insulation, and a network of survival had formed with Rita Kovach's fortress at its center. The National Guard commander stood inside the cabin, studying the walls with professional assessment. Who designed this? I did, Rita said. You have engineering background? I have experience surviving winter in a house that couldn't handle it. He nodded slowly. These walls probably saved lives. Not just the people in here. Everyone who knew this existed had a landmark to reach, a proof that survival was possible. After the guard evacuated those who needed medical attention and began clearing roads, people returned to assess their homes. The damage was worse than most had imagined. Jim Hendricks's store had lost thousands in burst pipe flooding. Margaret Flynn's house needed complete replumbing. The Morrison place had structural damage from ice. But Rita's cabin sat unchanged. The black volcanic stone had weathered the storm without a crack, without a leak, without a single sign of strain. While their houses had failed around them, her fortress had simply absorbed everything the storm delivered and held firm. The conversation started at the temporary shelter in the high school gym. I'm rebuilding with stone, David Morrison said, and nobody laughed. Double walls, Jim Hendricks added. Like Rita's. With that gap for insulation. Margaret Flynn nodded. I want those ceramic battery things. The heat storage. Within a week, half the town was planning renovations based on Rita's design. The volcanic stone quarry started getting calls from Nebraska, asking about bulk orders and shipping. An engineering firm from Omaha drove out specifically to study the cabin's construction. They found Rita replacing a hinge on the wood stove door. "Miss Kovach, we'd like to document your design," the lead engineer said. "With your permission, we think this could become a model for extreme weather residential construction." Rita considered this. People died during this storm? 3 statewide. Could have been hundreds. "Then document whatever you want." The engineer ran his hand along the interior stone. "How did you know to build it this way?" Rita set down her tools. "My husband died 2 years ago during a spring storm. He had a heart attack, and I couldn't get help because we were too isolated and the weather was too bad and our house was too cold." Her voice stayed even, factual. "I decided I'd never be that vulnerable again. So you built this." "So I built something that wouldn't fail me when everything else did." By spring, Grover's Bend had changed in visible ways. New construction followed Rita's model, thick stone walls becoming common instead of unusual. The town council established emergency shelter protocols with Rita's cabin designated as primary refuge. The hardware store started stocking volcanic stone and ceramic battery systems. But the deeper change was harder to see. It lived in the way people talked about winter now, with respect instead of casual confidence. In the way they prepared, stocking supplies in August instead of waiting until October. In the way they'd stopped dismissing worst-case scenarios as paranoia. One evening in late May, Rita sat on her small porch watching the sunset paint the prairie orange and gold. The land had thawed, green returning to replace the white that had dominated for so long. David Morrison walked up her drive, carrying something wrapped in cloth. "Wanted to return this," he said, handing it over. "The blankets you lent us. You could have kept them." "I know, but I wanted an excuse to come thank you properly." He looked at the black stone walls. "My family would have died without this place." "Without you?" Rita shook her head. "You would have found another way." "No," David said firmly. "We wouldn't have." Our house dropped to 15 degrees inside before we left. Another few hours and he didn't finish the thought. "What you did, building this, knowing it would matter someday, that's not luck. That's not paranoia. That's wisdom we should have listened to." After he left, Rita sat watching the prairie darken. The cabin stood solid behind her, its volcanic stone walls still radiating the day's absorbed warmth into the cooling evening. In the distance, Grover's Bend's lights flickered on, power restored at last. She thought about Carl, about the 3 hours she'd spent helpless while he died, about the choice she'd made afterward to never be that powerless again, about the town that had mocked her and then huddled inside her walls when their own collapsed. The story would spread, she knew, was already spreading. The woman who'd built a fortress and saved her town. They'd probably get it wrong, make it more dramatic than it was, turn her into something she wasn't. But the stone would remain. And the people who'd learned its value during those 5 frozen days would remember, would build differently, would prepare seriously, would understand that survival wasn't about hoping for the best, but about building for the worst and being grateful when it stood and used. Rita stood, running her hand along the black volcanic stone one more time before heading inside. The cabin would stand here long after she was gone, a monument not to paranoia, but to the simple truth that comfort was fragile and preparation was wisdom, and the difference between them was often the difference between life and death. The door closed with its heavy, weather-tight seal, and inside, the ceramic batteries glowed softly in the gathering dark, holding heat for whenever it would be needed again.